Okay, here it is, Chapter 5, Kinesiology 230. We're talking about responses and adaptations to resistance training. This is specific to acute responses, and this is presentation number 2. So without any further ado, let's get to it. We broke this out before in terms of what we're going to be going over for this series, this series of presentations. We're now into acute responses and chronic adaptations found on page 70. So acute responses are the adaptation that occur during the workout itself, right? And then shortly thereafter. You'll see things like when a person starts to work out, you'll have an increase in heart rate during the exercise itself, increased core temperature, reduced glycogen stores as we work out. We start to burn off the fuel stores. And then depleted creatine phosphate stores, which makes sense because that's what you use to help as a precursor to help you make your ATP. And then also increased need for protein as you rebuild the muscles. You have a couple different windows when you finish a workout, one of which is your body craves some carbohydrates because it wants to refuel itself. And then the other is a window where your body's saying, give me some protein because I need to rebuild myself. So it's partially like a refuel, rebuild kind of concept. And those windows are like 45 minutes for the refuel, within 45 minutes. And then the rebuild, if you will, for the protein, it's like an hour and a half later to 2 hours later. Chronic adaptations are the changes in the body, not in the body, that occur after repeated bouts of and persistent training over and over and over again. And what you'll see is this chronic adaptation where the resting heart rate will actually come down because the heart becomes more efficient at pumping blood, so it doesn't have to squeeze as many beats to circulate the same amount of blood. You'll have an increase in muscle mass and an increase of cardiovascular capacity. So when we look at both acute and chronic adaptations, we start to look at, say, like the muscle over here to the right. Again, I'll get back to it. We're talking about the stressor that we're placing on the human body, or I like to say the human organism, and it's a general adaptation syndrome personified. And it's the concept of having this progressive and systematic overload where we place progressive and systematic stress on the human organism to obtain the desired training response, right? So it's kind of like we in turn, in some regard, dose out the rep and set combinations that we'd like to have our clients or athletes perform. And we're doing that with the intention of having a desired training response. Now, when you're training for a wedding or you have your client training for just working out in general, that's different than this gentleman playing basketball or a football player or a tennis player where it becomes very sport specific. And that's the driver. And that's how you craft your programs to basically increase the performance of that individual. So, periodization, and I mentioned it earlier, is a systematic manipulation of different stressors to increase adaptations while reducing the likelihood of injury. Now, you can't eliminate them, but you do things in terms of you work with your athletes to try to push them towards that theoretical maximal ability, but you also have layered into that equation is or are times of download or even unloading the workouts themselves, where you take the athlete out of the training environment to allow them to recover, to allow them to maybe even mentally uncouple from the rigors of training. But you also have to have, within the context of a training week program, say it's a 12-week mesocycle, and a person's really crushing it in their workouts, you still have to have the concept of proper refueling, proper rest, proper recovery in general. You have to find ways to allow that through programming to allow your athlete or client to be able to feel the stressor, to get a stress adaptation response, but it's not so much where it actually just crushes the person, very much like our single-celled organism when it was overstressed. So if we get me out of the way here, when we're applying that stressor, you have your body's response itself as you start to apply the stressor. And this is just a real generalized description. I can probably spend 4 or 5 presentations on this. But your body will feel that stressor and then ends up kind of like almost getting pressed down a little bit, or the body has this kind of feeling of it's almost being crushed a little bit. I don't want to say it's being crushed, but it definitely feels like the workload. It feels the effects of the workload. But what happens is the body starts to adapt to that stressor that's placed on it, and then you see it start to actually overcome and overcompensate. And you have this, and the overarching goal is you're continually manipulating the stressor you're placing on the body to have that dip, but then have the overcompensation. And optimally, what you'd like to have is like when you get into an environment like an end of season wrestling tournament or an end of season track meet, you'd like to have it where you reduce the stressor enough where you have super compensation and it actually slopes uphill from here. If you continue with the stressor that you applied here through this process, and you don't change it or manipulate the represet variables, what ends up happening is you have this what's called decompensation phase, where the human organism actually starts to kind of shut down and goes into what's called an overtrained state, which we'll talk about later on in the very last presentation. So there's a lot of science that goes into this, and a lot of like crafting of the art and science of fitness training and coaching that all kind of come together. So the idea that we're placing these stressors upon the athlete or the client, and we're doing so in an acute manner or a chronic manner, meaning short-term manner or very long-term manner. And the goal is to have a specific adaptation within the context of a workout or the specific context of a week or the specific context of maybe 12 weeks, as we take a person from day one of off-season training all the way through 12 weeks to maybe a test out week somewhere, 3 months down the road. But you got to understand that muscles, connective tissue, central nervous system, and bones, they all adapt differently, right? And they all adapt at inherently different rates. And your programming has to accommodate for this. As we mentioned earlier, the nervous system actually gets more efficient at firing and firing the right motor units to make movement happen. And so it's not even a matter of your muscle really getting stronger. Well, if that's the case, then you're not putting the actual loading on the tendons, the connective tissue, for them to get stronger. So at that point, what you would do is, if you had somebody who didn't know what they were doing training wise, or they were a little bit too aggressive, they would end up loading up a little too much weight, working a little bit too hard, and they would end up with like a bursitis or a tendonitis because they would have an inflammation of the connective tissue, or perhaps they would end up injuring a muscle because they're working a little bit too hard too soon. So you're almost better like undershooting a little bit during the first couple of weeks, and then you go ahead and ramp up your intensity and your overall stressors that you place on the human organism. Getting back to that, skip on over. So when you look at that strength curve that you see on the front end, it gets back to like this concept and being able to know that you're going to place some kind of stressor on them. They're going to have this little shocky phase, and they're going to end up overcompensating, and then they're going to be met with that resistance. But that's where you have to be smart enough and adept enough at program design to change your variables. Now, with the neurological side, I mean, there's a component of, yes, it becomes more efficient in the ability to fire, but there's also a component where the central nervous system just gets better at heightening that communication up and down the central nervous system. Remember, we talked about efferent and afferent. Afferent was when you put your hand on the stove and you have a sensory side, oh my God, it's hot, and your brain goes, take your hand off the stove. That's afferent to efferent. And when you're working out, especially if you're doing, say, like explosive style training, the afferent side actually get tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter, where that communication happens sooner and sooner and sooner. And like, even if you stand up with one foot on a Bose, your foot will more than likely wobble. And then eventually your foot wobbles less and less and less, because there's a dampening effect of the communication that's happening up and down the central nervous system. So in terms of like a much more holistic kind of mindset to this, you have to be very aware of the fact that when you put load on a human body, that body's going to respond and go through a shock phase, but also it's the central nervous system, it's the connective tissue, all of that is going to go through those phases, but at inherently different rates. All right, so the adaptations themselves, they happen at the cellular level, especially when we're talking about strength. And the concept you have is you have the actin and the myosin here, just listed as A and M. When you're working out and you have these acute responses and chronic responses, you have these enzyme changes that happen that allow for the greater ability for a contraction to happen. And I don't want to get too 500 level on you here, but these pieces of the puzzle start to fall in place where you have the actual quality of the muscle protein, ATPase, or ATPase, is better able to bind and better able to allow the binding, between the myosin and the actin for the cross-bridge attachments. And you end up having these enzyme changes that allow for that more forceful contraction. And it increases the protein in the actin and the myosin that allows those little guys to row, from one side or the other to bring the Z's closer to the M. Both more weight wise, but also with more force, but also more power, meaning more quickly. And you also have the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system adaptations that we've talked about a couple times already. All right, so table 5.1, they throw some stuff in there, and I think it's worth a look for you guys to maybe take a look at this. If you want to freeze your screen here and take a look, but just get an idea. These are some of the neurological changes or neurological responses, muscular changes and endocrine changes that you'll see in the body. And this is just it for the list. These are the three main things for the acute responses that you see. This is table 5.1 in the book. I'm going to move us on to the next presentation. So guys, I'm out of here.